They laughed when I was kicked out of Christmas. But how would you react if your own family texted, "It's better if you don't come after. You'd paid for everything." I didn't fight back. I just pressed cancel payment on every charge they'd built their pride on. By sunrise, the tree, the feast, the cabin, all gone. And when their calls started flooding in, that's when I finally smiled. I'm Emily Carter, and this is how I turned their family holiday into their lesson in karma. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Late December 2024. Downtown. Portland was draped in strings of white lights that made every wet sidewalk shimmer. Inside the office of Cascade Realty Group, the building was almost empty the way I liked it. The end of the year always meant long nights of financial reports and endless numbers that didn't lie the way people did. The hum of my computer filled the quiet. I leaned back in my chair, rubbed my temples, and told myself I'd leave after I finished one last spreadsheet. My phone buzzed against the desk. I barely glanced at it, expecting another notification from a client, or maybe the company chat. But when I saw the name, my stomach turned. Dad. The message preview glowed against the dark screen. Christmas isn't for you this year. Don't come. No punctuation. No warmth. Just a command. For a second, I thought maybe he'd meant to send it to someone else. But then the next ping came. My sister Heather replying in the family group chat. It's better that way. A string of laughing emojis followed from relatives I hadn't seen in months. The air in the office suddenly felt thinner. I stared at the messages, reading them over and over like maybe the meaning would change if I blinked enough times. It didn't. I scrolled up the chat. Pictures of the ski cabin in Bend, the giant gold Christmas tree, and the family dinner I had paid the deposit for back in October. Everyone was talking about what to bring, who would share rooms, which wine to buy. Not one mention of me. A cold laugh slipped out. Of course. I set the phone down, the glow of it reflecting in my coffee mug like a small, cruel moon. For a moment, I just sat there listening to the building creak in the winter wind. Then my fingers found the trackpad. I opened my email, searching for receipts I already knew were there. Bend Mountain Lodge, paid by E. Carter. Evergreen Catering, paid by E. Carter. Golden Spruce Tree Rentals, paid by E. Carter. Every transaction neatly tied to my card. I stared at the list, remembering how Dad had smiled at me during Thanksgiving, saying, "You're always so responsible. Em, you make things happen." I guess I did. Right up until they decided they didn't need me to. My hand hovered over the mouse. I could almost hear his voice in my head, that calm, patronizing tone he used when I was little. Don't overreact. This time, I did. One by one, I clicked. Remove payment method. The screen flickered each time. Processing, removed. Processing, removed. Processing, removed. Each click felt like cutting a string I hadn't realized was wrapped around my throat. When the list finally cleared, I leaned back, staring at the blank page. The office light reflected off the black monitor, showing my face. Tired eyes, drawn lips. But something else there, too. Relief. I whispered to no one. "Merry Christmas to me." The heater kicked on a low hum that filled the silence. I gathered my bag and coat, shutting down the computer. On my way out, I turned off the overhead lights. The office fell into darkness, except for the faint blue from the street below. As I stepped outside, snowflakes drifted down in slow, deliberate spirals. They caught in my hair and melted on my cheeks. The city was quiet, the kind of stillness that feels almost sacred. Cars hissed through slush a block away. Somewhere distant bells played a holiday tune. I stood there on the sidewalk for a long moment, my breath misting in the air, phone still heavy in my pocket. I could have called him, asked why, begged for a reason. But I already knew it. Dad's world was built on image, on order, on keeping the family shiny and intact. And me, I'd stopped fitting into the picture. I walked to my car, the snow crunching under my boots. The inside smelled faintly of pine air freshener and cold leather. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked strange, almost like a stranger's face. Someone who'd finally stopped trying. As I pulled out of the garage, the phone buzzed again. I didn't look. The city lights blurred past gold and red and white. Each one reflected off the windshield like tiny fragments of the life I'd been financing for years. By the time I turned onto the empty stretch toward my apartment, the snow was falling harder, muting everything. It felt like the world was folding in on itself, hiding its noise, giving me a clean slate. The building was quiet when I parked. I climbed the stairs, my breath visible in the hallway. Inside my apartment, the heat hit me, too warm, too bright. I kicked off my shoes, dropped my bag, and sat on the couch. The silence felt heavy, but not empty. I opened my phone one last time, scrolled through the group chat again. The laughter icons glittered under the message that had started it all. Christmas isn't for you this year. Don't come. This time, I didn't feel the sting, just a strange calm. I deleted the chat to one swipe gone. Outside my window, the streetlight flickered over the falling snow. It looked peaceful, pure, like the start of something honest. I curled up under a blanket and let the quiet settle around me, a quiet that no one could take away. The sound that woke me wasn't the alarm. It was the phone buzzing against the nightstand again and again like it had something urgent to say. The sun had barely crept through the blinds, pale and hesitant, when I rolled over and squinted at the screen. 23 missed calls. My father's name appeared over and over, then my mother's, then Heather's. The text notifications stacked up like debris. The cabin's canceled. You ruined everything. Call us back now. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat steady in a way it hadn't been in years. There was a time when one angry message from Dad could unravel my whole morning. Now it felt distant, like static from a radio station I no longer tuned into. I sat up, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and padded into the kitchen. The hardwood was cold beneath my feet. The smell of coffee filled the small apartment as I switched on the machine. The first sip burned a little, grounding me. From upstairs came the soft shuffle of footsteps. "Morning, Mom," Lucas said, voice still half asleep. He was 10, all skinny arms and messy hair, sticking up in every direction. He climbed onto a chair and rubbed his eyes. "Grandpa called 3 times last night," he mumbled. "Are we not going to Christmas?" I turned from the counter, meeting his gaze. "No, bud," I said gently. "Not this year. This year, it's just you and me." He blinked, confused. "Why not?" I hesitated, choosing my words. Sometimes even families need a little space to figure out how to be kind again. He frowned, processing it, then shrugged the way kids do when something doesn't make sense but isn't worth fighting. "Can we still do cookies?" That made me smile. "Absolutely. Double chocolate." He grinned. "Triple." I nodded, relieved by the simplicity of his world. When he wandered off to find the cat, I checked my phone again. New messages. Mom's voice filled the voicemail box, thin and strained. "Emily, what have you done? Your father's furious." "This isn't how family behaves," he says. I hit delete before she could finish. The phone beeped softly as the message vanished. My fingers tightened around the mug until the ceramic pressed into my palm. Funny how they call it family when it only works one way. The kitchen clock ticked too loudly. I looked out the window. The neighbors across the street were stringing lights around their porch railings, laughing as the wind tangled the wires. The woman next door waved cheerfully when she caught my eye, her face red from the cold. I waved back with a half smile I didn't feel. On the counter, my phone buzzed again, a vibration that seemed louder in the quiet. I flipped it over, face down. The relief was immediate. A soft chime came from my laptop on the kitchen table. A work notification. I opened it without thinking. The message from corporate HR blinked at the top. "Please maintain discretion regarding recent personal matters. Company image is everyone's responsibility." I laughed once under my breath, a sound without humor. Even the people who barely knew me were already forming opinions. Gossip traveled faster than snowmelt. Lucas came back with a Lego spaceship in his hands. "Can we go to the park later?" he asked. "Sure," I said. "After we make cookies." He nodded, content, and sprawled on the rug to play. I leaned against the counter, watching him. Children have a way of pulling you back into the present, whether you want to go or not. The coffee cooled. I set the mug down and opened my messages one last time. Dad had sent another text. "You're acting childish. Fix what you broke. No hello, no question. Just command as always." I didn't reply. I scrolled to his name, pressed mute notifications. The silence after that click was better than any apology could ever be. Outside, snow began again, light, hesitant flakes swirling against the gray sky. It covered the street like a slow eraser, blurring everything harsh and sharp. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Rachel. Taking the day off. Need to breathe. Within seconds, she replied. Good. You deserve one. I'll cover the client emails. I smiled at the screen, then set it down for good. No more alerts, no more buzzing. Just stillness. By mid-morning, Lucas and I were in the kitchen again. He stood on a chair stirring cookie dough with serious concentration, tongue between his teeth. Flour dusted the counter, his hair. Even my sweater. Too much sugar, I warned. He looked up wide-eyed. That's not a thing, Mom. I laughed. Really laughed this time. Fair point. The smell of baking chocolate filled the room. We played Christmas songs on the old Bluetooth speaker, off-key and cheerful. The kind of music that once made me anxious because it reminded me of obligations of forced smiles at long tables. Now it just sounded like background noise to a life that finally belonged to me. When the timer beeped, Lucas pulled the tray out carefully with oven mitts too big for his hands. He placed one cookie on a plate and handed it to me like it was something sacred. Merry Christmas, Mom. I took a bite, the warmth melting across my tongue. Merry Christmas, kiddo. He grinned, his teeth smudged with chocolate. We should make this a new tradition. Yeah, I said softly. I think we just did. Outside, snow kept falling. Soft, steady quiet. The phone buzzed again from the counter, vibrating in short, angry bursts. I let it. I watched the flakes swirl instead, each one disappearing into the growing white. The noise eventually stopped. The room smelled of sugar and cocoa, and for the first time in years, Christmas morning didn't feel like something I'd been left out of. It felt like something I'd finally chosen. 2 days later, I woke to a different kind of storm. Not the quiet one made of snow, but the loud, invisible kind made of words. The kind that travels faster than light and cuts deeper than anything physical ever could. I didn't notice it right away. I was pouring coffee, scrolling absently through emails, when a headline caught my eye. Local Voices Online, a blog tied to Westbrook Community Church, where my father had been a member for over 20 years. The title hit me square in the chest. Richard Carter's Daughter Cuts. Ties with family before Christmas. My coffee turned bitter in my mouth. Beneath the headline were screenshots, our family group chat clear as day, Dad's message. Christmas isn't for you this year. Don't come. Heather's response. It's better that way. And my silence below them, a single unread message. Someone had taken those images and sent them to a church gossip page, and now it had made its way into a dozen other community forums. The article painted me as a bitter, spoiled daughter who turned her back on her devoted father. A photo from my LinkedIn profile sat next to the story, cropped awkwardly to make me look cold. Comments scrolled beneath it. She sounds ungrateful. Imagine embarrassing your dad like that right before Christmas. People these days have no respect. My phone started ringing before I even processed it. Rachel's name flashed across the screen. I answered. Emily. Your family's in the news, she said, voice low and urgent. Are you okay? I leaned against the counter, staring out the window. I'm fine, I said automatically. My voice didn't sound like mine. Truth travels fast when it's ugly. You want me to call the PR team? We can issue a statement if this affects work. I laughed under my breath. A statement? About what? My father's group chat. Just checking. She hesitated. Do you want me to come over? I said softly. Thanks, though. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, but didn't touch it. My inbox kept pinging. Friends forwarding the article, old coworkers sending awkward messages of sympathy. One even wrote, hope you guys can patch things up. Holidays are about family. They didn't understand. They never would. That evening, the sun sank early, painting the sky the same steel gray as my mood. Lucas was upstairs working on a science project. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of his pencil against paper. I checked my email out of habit, and froze again. New message. Subject line. I'm sorry. From Nina Morales. The name took a second to place. Heather's assistant, the woman who managed her social media and coordinated her brand partnerships. I clicked. Emily. The message began. I know you don't know me well, but I couldn't watch them fake it anymore. I'm the one who leaked the screenshots. I didn't do it to hurt you. I just wanted people to see what they really are. I thought maybe the truth would help you not destroy you. I'm sorry if I made things worse. I read it 3 times, my pulse steady. Anger flickered once, and then faded. I felt nothing like hate. Maybe something closer to relief. I typed back one sentence. You didn't hurt me, Nina. You just turned on the lights. Then I deleted the draft instead of sending it. Some truths don't need witnesses. Hours passed. I sat on the couch with the TV off. The glow from my laptop still open to the article. The comments were piling up by the minute. Someone had posted a photo of Dad at church with a caption, "Pray for this good man. Some children lose their way." Another had added, "God will humble her." I shut the laptop. My reflection caught in the dark screen. Still pale, unreadable. My father had always known how to control the narrative. He didn't have to post anything. Others would defend him. He was the kind of man who smiled in public and scolded in private. And Heather, she'd follow his lead like always. Sure enough, minutes later, my phone buzzed again. A notification from Instagram. Heather had posted a story. Family is complicated, but forgiveness heals all. The caption sat beneath a photo of her hugging Dad in front of the church tree, both smiling. Forgiveness. That word always sounded like a command when it came from them. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. My thumb hovered over the app, then closed it. I turned the phone face down. The apartment dimmed as night settled. I didn't turn on any lights. The glow from the street lamps outside painted soft patterns on the walls. Lucas called from upstairs. "Mom, can I finish this tomorrow?" "Sure, honey. Brush your teeth first." His footsteps padded down the hall. A moment later, his door closed. The silence after that felt alive. The internet burned on without me. People would share, speculate, argue. Maybe tomorrow there'd be another post. Maybe Dad would go on the record. Maybe Heather would pretend to reconcile on camera. I sank deeper into the couch. The hum of the fridge, the ticking clock, the faint wind pressing against the windows, all of it folded around me like static. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise or a courtroom. Sometimes it's just a single match dropped into the right pile of lies. Outside, the snow began again, heavier this time, coating the cars and roofs in a slow, white silence. I looked toward the window, saw my reflection blend into the city beyond, half shadow, half light. "Let it burn," I whispered. The snow kept falling steady and unbothered, as if it knew the world would find its own balance eventually. By morning, the story had spread beyond Westbrook. Local news stations picked it up, the kind of filler piece they used between weather and sports. An affluent church family torn apart by a daughter's betrayal. The camera zoomed in on the church sign where my father chaired the community board. Evergreen Fellowship. I could almost smell the polished wood and gilt. He must have seen it too. I imagined him sitting at the head of the table that morning, surrounded by men in gray suits, pretending not to stare. My father never tolerated whispers. And that day, there were plenty. "Who leaked it?" He barked, his voice echoing against the paneled walls. The question wasn't really a question. It was a threat dressed as one. When no one answered, he slammed his briefcase onto the table so hard, a pen rolled onto the floor. Pastor Daniels cleared his throat gently. "Richard," he said, using that careful, soothing tone people reserve for wild animals. "People are concerned. They're questioning your leadership example." My father's jaw tightened. "I've led this community for 2 decades. Don't you think I know what they're whispering?" Daniels sighed. "They'll forget soon enough, but it might help to show a little humility. Maybe a statement about family reconciliation." "Humility," my father snapped. "That girl humiliated me. She humiliated us all. And you think I should apologize?" Across the table, the younger members exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. They knew better. My father collected silence the way other men collected trophies. That night, my phone rang. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. His voice came through before I said a word. "You embarrassed this family," he said, each word clipped. "You embarrassed me." I stared at the ceiling phone pressed loosely against my ear. "No, Dad," I said. "I just stopped paying for the performance." There was a pause, long enough to hear him exhale through his nose, that sound he made when he was trying not to yell. "You ungrateful child. After all I've done. After all I paid for, I cut in." The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, I could almost hear his mind working, calculating which part of that sentence insulted him most. Then the line clicked dead. I set the phone on the table and stared at it. The clock on the wall ticked 3 times before it started ringing again, this time from Mom. I let it go to voicemail. At the Carter house, he was still pacing the kitchen. The hardwood creaked under his shoes. Margaret stood near the doorway holding a mug she hadn't sipped from in 10 minutes. "She's your daughter," she said softly. "She's your failure," he snapped. "You always coddled her, always defended her. This is what you raised, a disloyal, arrogant woman who thinks she's above her own family." "She's not disloyal," Margaret said, trembling now. "She's tired." He turned on her, eyes sharp. "Don't you start. This is on you as much as it's on her." He grabbed his phone, scrolling through contacts until he landed on Michael Reed, his old college friend and retired attorney. "Michael," he said as soon as the call connected, "I need to talk about something. Hypothetically." Margaret watched, frozen in the doorway. She'd seen this version of him before. The man who believed control could rewrite the truth. "I want to know what it looks like if someone causes financial harm to their family, by canceling payments, destroying plans," he continued. "If that's grounds for a civil claim." On the other end, Michael hesitated. "Richard, you're talking about Emily, aren't you? You can't sue your daughter over hurt feelings. This isn't about feelings. It's about accountability." Margaret turned away, whispering to herself. "This will destroy us." Upstairs, the bedroom lights flickered as the storm outside thickened. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to him argue with an old friend through the walls. The sound of his voice, calm, deliberate venom wrapped in civility, made her chest tighten. When he finally hung up, he stood by the window, looking out over the snowy yard. The glass reflected his own face back at him, older-lined, unfamiliar. "He said there's no case," Margaret said quietly. "He's wrong," my father muttered. "There's always a case." Meanwhile, across town, I was putting Lucas to bed. He wanted to stay up to finish reading, but his eyelids were heavy. I kissed his forehead and whispered goodnight. In my room, I changed into an old sweatshirt, left the lamp on low, and lay staring at the ceiling. My phone sat on the nightstand, black screen facing up like a mirror. The house was warm, but I felt the kind of chill that comes from something shifting beneath the surface, like a fault line finally giving way. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel anger, just a fragile sort of peace that scared me more than fury ever had. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling them softly. Somewhere in the city, my father was already planning his next move, the next way to make me small again. I didn't know that yet. I only knew that for the first time I'd said no, and meant it. The snow fell heavier that night, muffling the world, until everything felt distant. I turned off the lamp and closed my eyes. In the dark, I thought I heard the faint echo of his voice from years ago, the same one that used to keep me obedient. But it faded quickly, lost beneath the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Monday morning hit like a hangover I hadn't earned, the kind where you wake up tired of people, not alcohol. I parked outside Cascade Realty Group and sat in the car, longer than I should have, watching my breath fog the windshield. The snow had turned to slush overnight, gray, uneven, the way everything feels after it loses its sparkle. Inside, the office smelled like burnt coffee and suspicion. Conversations dimmed the moment I walked in. People didn't even bother to hide it anymore. Someone at the reception desk whispered, "That's her. The one who canceled Christmas." I kept walking. My heels clicked across the floor louder than I meant them to. When I reached my desk, Rachel looked up from hers and gave me a sympathetic half-smile. "He wants to see you," she mouthed, tilting her chin toward the hallway. David Miller's office was at the far end, corner view glass walls, transparent in theory, opaque in practice. He was standing by the window when I knocked. "Come in," he said, not looking up right away. "Emily." He began turning finally, his tone rehearsed. "The press is connecting your name to Richard Carter's situation. Some of our clients are asking questions." I folded my arms lightly, not defensive, but steady. "I've done nothing wrong. I know," he said, his voice careful, polite, "but perception is everything. Until things calm down, maybe take a few days off. With pay." I stared at him for a long beat. "You're worried about gossip more than numbers." He sighed. "I'm worried about clients. You know how this industry is." I forced a nod. "Sure." Optics. The word tasted bitter. On the way out, I caught Rachel watching from her cubicle. I gave her a small shrug that said, "It's fine." She followed me to the elevator anyway. "This is bullshit," she muttered once the doors closed. I smirked. "You think, what are you gonna do, bake cookies with my kid? Pretend this isn't my circus? At home, the apartment felt different during daylight, quieter, smaller. Lucas was at school, and I finally had time to sit with the noise in my own head. I threw my coat on the couch and called Rachel. "I'm being punished for being honest," I said, pacing between the kitchen and living room. "Then prove them wrong," she said. "You always do." 2 days later, my phone buzzed before sunrise. Rachel's name flashed across the screen. Emily. "Everything's down," she said without greeting. Her voice was high, urgent. "The accounting system crashed. No one can process payments. David's losing it." I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes. How bad get? He's talking about calling outside consultants. I could hear the chaos behind her. Phones ringing, people talking over each other. I pulled my hair into a messy bun. "Send me the access credentials. I'll remote in." There was a pause. "Are you sure you're technically still on leave? Rachel," I said, grabbing my laptop from the desk. "Tell him to relax. I'm not coming back. I'm saving his ass." She laughed once, a mix of relief and disbelief. "You're insane. Always have been." The system was worse than she'd described. Payments frozen mid-transfer reconciliations, looping in error messages. I spent the entire morning coding fixes, bypassing corrupt backups, eating stale cereal with one hand while typing with the other. By the next day, I'd rebuilt the client database manually. My eyes burned, but when the system pinged green, fully functional, I let out a sound that was half laugh, half groan. I texted Rachel. "It's done." An hour later, David called. His tone had changed completely. "Emily, I don't know how you did it, but you saved us. The clients are back online. I can't thank you enough." I leaned back in the chair. "You could start by remembering this the next time someone questions my value." He hesitated. Message received. When I hung up, I looked around the room. Papers, coffee cups, the hum of the heater. It was messy, lived in mine. Across town, my father stood before a different audience. I didn't see it live, but the clip hit local news later that night. The headline read, "Community Leader Addresses Family Rumors." He stood behind a podium at Evergreen Fellowship, hands gripping the edges, eyes darting between cameras. "I want to clarify that my family's situation has been misrepresented," he said, with that politician's calm he'd perfected. "We're working through a private matter. I ask for respect during this time." The camera zoomed in slightly. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I watched the clip twice. The first time I felt that old sting, the one that comes from being painted as the villain. The second time I just felt tired. Parallel lives. He was out there trying to restore his image. I was here fixing systems that actually mattered. I went into Lucas's room to check on him before bed. He was asleep, one hand clutching a small plastic spaceship. I pulled the blanket over his shoulder. In the living room, I turned off the TV and sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. For once, there was nothing to fix, nothing to defend. Just quiet. The snow had stopped, leaving behind that strange metallic stillness Portland gets after a storm. I stood by the window and thought about how different peace feels when you stop earning it for everyone else. The next morning, I woke to a message from David. "Take tomorrow off. You deserve it." I smiled faintly. I already had. The letter came on a Tuesday morning in March, buried under junk mail and an energy bill. The envelope was heavy cream-colored, embossed with the words Carter and Associates at the top, a firm my father had used for years. I slid it open with a kitchen knife, still half asleep, coffee in hand. Richard Carter versus Emily Carter. Civil suit, breach of family trust. For a long moment, I just stared at the page. The words didn't sting. They almost made me laugh. I set the letter beside my mug, shook my head, and said out loud to the empty kitchen, "Of course he did." The grounds for the lawsuit were absurd reputational and financial harm caused by the deliberate cancellation of prepaid family arrangements. My father was suing me because I had stopped paying for his holidays. By noon, Rachel had already seen the news alert online. She called in a panic. "You're trending again. Local businessman sues daughter." This is insane. I pinched the bridge of my nose. It's not insane. It's predictable. Are you going to fight it? I looked out the window at the still, gray morning. I'm going to end it. Later that week, I drove to Boulder to meet with Mark Ellison, a lawyer recommended by one of Rachel's clients. His office sat above a bookstore on Pearl Street, the smell of paper and old wood mixing with fresh coffee. He was in his mid-40s, calm eyes, deliberate voice. The kind of man who didn't fill silence unless it mattered. He skimmed the letter once, twice, then looked at me. "Your father's claim is weak," he said. "There's no contract, no fiduciary agreement, but he's doing this to save face. He wants control back." I leaned back in the chair. "That's what he's best at." Mark smiled slightly. "Then let's make sure he loses it." The hearing was set for early April at the county courthouse. By the time I arrived that morning, reporters already lined the steps, their breath puffing in the cold. Someone shouted my name. I kept walking, head down, coat collar high. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and tension. I sat beside Mark at the defense table. Across from us, my father adjusted his tie, his old friend Michael Reed at his side. Michael gave me a polite nod, the kind lawyers give to people they're about to dismantle. When the bailiff called the case, my father straightened like a man reclaiming his authority. His attorney began with words like betrayal, humiliation, and financial loss. He painted a picture of a daughter acting out of malice, deliberately destroying a carefully planned family event. I didn't react. Mark's hand brushed my elbow, a silent reminder. "Stay still." Then it was our turn. Mark stood slowly, slid a folder onto the table. "Your Honor." He began the plaintiff claims financial harm. We claim ownership. He presented each document one by one, statements showing every reservation, every invoice, every deposit paid from my personal account. The judge flipped through them silently, the shuffle of paper echoing in the room. Then came the receipts with my name printed neatly across the top. Proof that every so-called family purchase was funded by me alone. My father shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched. Michael leaned toward him, whispering something, but his eyes stayed on me, and for the first time they didn't look like they belonged to a man in control. They looked small. Mark's voice stayed calm. "Mr. Carter," he said, turning toward the witness stand, "did your daughter ever sign an agreement obligating her to pay for family events?" My father hesitated. "No, but there was an understanding." "An understanding," Mark repeated. "Not a contract." "No," he admitted. "Then what we have here isn't a breach of trust, Your Honor. It's a breach of entitlement." The gallery stirred. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. My father's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked at Michael, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The rest went quickly. The judge leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "The court finds no legal basis for this claim. The suit is dismissed." He banged the gavel once final. My father didn't move for a full second, as if his body couldn't accept what had just happened. Then, with a sharp motion, he slammed his briefcase shut, stood, and walked out, without a word. Cameras flashed outside the courtroom windows as he passed. Mark exhaled and gathered the papers. "Well," he said, "that's that." I looked at him. "That's something." He smiled faintly. "You didn't just win a case. You took back your name." Outside, the reporters had gathered at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Microphones, questions, the same rehearsed faces. Emily. "Did you really cancel your family's Christmas? How does it feel to be sued by your father?" I didn't answer. The snow had started again, thin flakes carried by the wind. It dusted my hair, melted on my gloves. I pushed through the crowd, the sound of their voices fading behind me. At the edge of the parking lot, I paused. The courthouse loomed behind me, cold and gray. My breath hung in the air, visible for a second, before disappearing. Justice doesn't need noise, just proof. I got into my car, closed the door, and sat there for a while, hands resting on the steering wheel. Somewhere across town, my father was probably surrounded by reporters trying to spin his defeat into dignity. But for once, I didn't care what story he told. The engine hummed softly as I pulled out of the lot. Snow swirled across the highway, catching in the headlights like ash. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not victory, not relief, but the quiet knowledge that I had finally stepped out from under his shadow. The road stretched ahead, pale and endless, leading home. The rain had been falling since dawn, soft and steady, the kind that makes the world look cleaner than it really is. I sat in the corner of a small cafe off Pearl Street in Boulder, laptop open, half working, half pretending to. My reflection stared back at me in the window. Eyes tired, but calmer than they'd been in months. I was finishing an expense report when the bell above the door chimed. I didn't look up right away. The air shifted the way it does when someone familiar enters a room. I turned, and there she was. My mother. Margaret Carter, dressed neatly in her beige coat hair pinned back, clutching an envelope, like it was the only thing keeping her hands from shaking. For a second, I thought about pretending I didn't see her. But she saw me first, and it was too late. She walked over her heels, clicking softly on the tile. "You shouldn't be here, Mom," I said. My voice came out flat, more tired than angry. "I know," she said quickly, lowering herself into the chair across from me. Her perfume, something floral and too expensive, lingered between us. "I didn't call because I knew you wouldn't answer. You're right." She looked down at the envelope, smoothing its edges. "Your father's losing control," she said quietly. "He thinks everyone's against him now. He barely speaks to anyone at church. He blames me for the case, for the leak, for everything." I closed the laptop. "He needs someone to blame. That's how he breathes." Margaret winced. "I stayed quiet too long," she admitted. "I thought if I didn't pick a side it would keep peace. But there's no peace in pretending." She slid the envelope across the table. The flap was already open. "I wrote this before the trial. I didn't send it because I was afraid it would make things worse. I wanted to say, I'm sorry, for pretending not to see what you carried." I looked down at it but didn't touch it. The handwriting on the front was careful and small. "To Emily." "What's in it?" I asked. "It's a letter," she said. "An apology. And the truth. I knew you were paying for everything even years ago. The trips, the dinners, the church donations in Dad's name. I told myself it wasn't my place to intervene." I leaned back in my chair, staring at her. "Why are you telling me this now?" Her voice cracked. "Because I can't keep being the person who watches him hurt people and calls it love." I picked up the envelope and held it for a moment before setting it down again. "I don't need an apology," I said softly. "I just need honesty." For once, tears welled in her eyes. "He'll never change," she said, "but maybe I can." I wanted to believe her. God, I did. But part of me wondered if she'd come for forgiveness or permission to feel better. I stirred the cold coffee in my cup and glanced toward the rain outside. The sky was low and heavy, pressing against the glass. "Lucas asks about you," I said. After a long pause, her face brightened, hopeful. "He does, yeah. He asked why you and Dad don't visit anymore. What did you tell him, that sometimes people need to grow separately?" She swallowed hard. "That's kinder than we deserve." Silence stretched between us. The sound of rain filled the space where words failed. I folded my hands on the table, feeling the distance between us, so small physically but miles emotionally. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you," she whispered. "You were right about him, about me." I met her eyes. "It's not about being right, it's about being done." The waitress passed by with a fresh pot of coffee. I shook my head when she offered a refill, then reached for my wallet and placed a few bills under the saucer. Margaret looked panicked suddenly, as if she wasn't ready for this moment to end. "Emily, wait, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you hate me?" I thought about it. The years of tiptoeing the Christmases spent performing her silence every time Dad's temper filled a room. I thought about the little girl version of me who used to look at her mother for help and found only fear. Then I shook my head. "No, I don't hate you. I just don't want to keep playing the same part." Her tears spilled over. "I don't want that either." I stood, slid the chair back gently. "Then don't." She nodded, unable to speak. I reached across the table, rested my hand on her shoulder, then leaned down and hugged her. Briefly, awkwardly, but real. Her body trembled against mine. "Take care of yourself, Mom," I said. When I stepped outside, the drizzle had turned to mist. The air smelled like wet earth and coffee grounds. I walked down Pearl Street slowly, the letter still in my hand, unopened. I thought about reading it, but something told me I didn't need to. I already knew what it said. Forgiveness doesn't always mean returning. Sometimes it's just letting go of the need to be understood. I reached the corner and turned back once. Through the cafe window, I saw my mother still sitting there, the letter pressed against her chest, the cafe lights flickering gently around her. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was a beginning she would have to write on her own. The summer came fast that year, thick with heat and noise. By July, Denver felt like it was holding its breath. The gossip that had once swirled around my name had found a new home. My sister's. It started with one headline on a celebrity blog: Sarah Whitmore's perfect family Christmas was a lie. Then another followed, this time with photos. Her smiling at charity events side by side with my father, captions like hypocrisy in high heels. Within a week, every brand that once called her authentic started quietly pulling out. I didn't gloat when I saw it. I wish I could say I didn't look, but I did. There she was, standing outside her townhouse, makeup-smudged phone in hand, paparazzi cameras flashing. It was strange seeing her through their lens, still performing, but the curtain had finally slipped. That night, while I sat in the car outside a grocery store, my phone rang. Her name lit up the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me couldn't. When I answered, her voice was cracked and raw. "Are you happy now? You got what you wanted." The sound of it hit me in the chest. "No, Sarah," I said quietly. "What I wanted was peace. You mistook silence for weakness." She laughed bitterly through tears. "Dad made me post that apology video. He said it would fix everything. He said people would forgive me. Did they?" "It ruined me," she whispered. "Do you even know what it's like to lose everything you built?" I almost said yes, but I knew she wasn't ready to hear that she and I weren't that different. "Sarah," I said instead, "what did you think was going to happen?" "You lied for him. You let him turn you into a prop." There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing fast and uneven, the faint click of her pacing on the tile floor. "He said it would help the family," she finally said. "He said if I stayed quiet, people would move on, and you believed him." "Of course I did," she said, her voice cracking again. "He's Dad. He's always right." I didn't respond right away. Through the windshield, the sun was sinking, painting the parking lot in that golden light that makes everything look softer than it feels. "You think this is about me embarrassing him," I said, but all I did was stop pretending. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You think I didn't know about the payments I froze?" "I knew," she said, almost defiant. "I knew you were paying for everything. I didn't say anything because I couldn't. If I admitted it, I'd lose what I'd built. I thought if I was perfect enough, if I didn't make waves, he'd love me more." The words hung there trembling. "You're not the only one who thought that," I said softly. She didn't speak again for a while. I could hear her crying quietly, the kind of sound that doesn't ask for pity, just release. I thought about all those years, the two of us at the same dinner tables, listening to the same lectures, learning to survive the same way by pleasing him. She just did it better. When she finally spoke again, her voice was small. "I don't know how to fix it." "You don't," I said. "You just stop letting him decide who you are." Her breath hitched. "That's easy for you. You walked away. Walking away wasn't easy," I said. "It was necessary." She didn't answer. Somewhere behind her, a door slammed. Maybe the wind, maybe her husband leaving the room. Then a soft click. She'd hung up. I sat there with the phone still in my hand, the screen gone dark. The air inside the car felt heavy. I turned off the engine and let the silence settle. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. A notification. "Sarah Whitmore has deleted her account." For a moment, I didn't know what to feel. Relief. Sadness. It all blurred together until it felt like nothing but exhaustion. I rolled down the window. The evening air was thick with the smell of rain on hot pavement. Across the street, people were laughing outside a bar, their lives untouched by any of this. I thought about Sarah, her perfectly curated life now gone in a flash. About Dad, probably blaming everyone but himself. About Mom, still standing somewhere in between. And about me, still trying to convince myself that peace and loneliness weren't the same thing. I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly. We were all paying rent to belong in a house that was never home. I started the car, the sound breaking the quiet. As I pulled away from the curb, the lights from the grocery store flickered behind me, fading into the night. By late August, the heat had started to fade, but the city was buzzing again. This time, not with summer energy, but with scandal. I was making breakfast when I saw his face on the front page of the Boulder Gazette sitting on my neighbor's porch as I walked out for the mail. The headline took up half the page: "Richard Carter resigns, a mid-church investigation." His photo showed him mid-sentence, pale, and strained, his once perfect hair damp from sweat or nerves. By noon, every local outlet had picked it up. The church board had announced a temporary leave of absence that everyone knew wasn't temporary. The official reason to preserve the integrity of leadership. The real reason the community had turned on him. Donations were down, whispers were up, and apparently the church council didn't appreciate having its name dragged through gossip blogs. He called a press conference that same afternoon at Evergreen Fellowship, desperate to control the fire. I didn't go, but Rachel texted me a clip within minutes. There he was, standing at a podium, the familiar dark suit, his American flag lapel pin gleaming under the lights. Cameras flashed in his face as he began. "My family's personal matters have been grossly exaggerated. We are working through private issues. I ask that the media respect our privacy." He tried to smile, but the edges cracked. A reporter from Channel 7 stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," she called out, "is it true you sued your daughter for canceling your family's Christmas trip?" The room went dead silent. His expression flickered. Shock, then anger. "That's not relevant," he snapped. "No more questions." He slammed his hand down on the podium, the sound sharp enough to echo. Cameras captured it perfectly. The clip went viral within hours. Online people replayed it on loop, some mocking, some defending. "You can't lead a church and lose your family." One commenter wrote, "He's a hypocrite," said another. For the first time, his voice didn't sound powerful. It sounded small, trapped human. At her apartment across town, my mother watched it unfold on the evening news. She sat with her coffee untouched, the living room dark, except for the glow of the television. When his face filled the screen, she whispered into the quiet, "You did this to yourself." I didn't call her, and she didn't call me. There was nothing to say that would fix any of it. That night, rain started again. A steady, unrelenting drizzle that made the streets glisten under the streetlights. I'd just finished putting Lucas to bed when I heard tires crunching on the wet gravel outside. At first, I thought it was the neighbor coming home late, but then headlights cut across the front windows. My stomach dropped. I opened the door before he could knock. My father stood on the porch, soaked through his jacket clinging to his shoulders, gray hair plastered to his forehead. The rain ran down his face like tears he wouldn't let himself shed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "You happy now?" he asked finally. His voice wasn't sharp. It was hollow, quieter than I'd ever heard it. I stared at him, my hand still on the doorknob. "No," I said, "but I'm finally free." He blinked like he hadn't expected that answer. His eyes flicked past me into the house, the warm light spilling from the living room. Lucas's drawings pinned to the wall, the smell of hot cocoa still hanging in the air. A life that looked nothing like his. Nothing like the one he'd built. "You think freedom makes you better than family?" he said. "No," I answered evenly. "It just makes me honest." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You've always thought you were above us, You think your independence makes you right." I met his gaze. "I don't think I'm right, Dad. I just stopped pretending you are." His jaw twitched. For the first time, I saw something crack behind his eyes. Not rage, not authority, but exhaustion. He looked older, smaller, as if the years had finally caught up with him all at once. "You embarrassed me," he said again, but the words had no heat left in them, only habit. "You embarrassed yourself," I said quietly. He didn't answer. The rain filled the silence between us. A car passed down the street, headlights sweeping over his face before disappearing into the dark. He shifted his weight, glancing back toward his car. "I just wanted respect," he said almost to himself. "You had it," I replied. "You just never gave it back." He nodded once, the faintest motion, then stepped off the porch. The sound of his shoes against the wet gravel followed him down the walkway. He didn't look back. I stood in the doorway long after the taillights vanished down the road. The rain dripped from the gutter steady and soft. When I finally closed the door, the house felt heavier somehow, but not in a bad way, just full of everything unsaid. Lucas stirred upstairs, murmuring in his sleep. I went to check on him. He was fine, breathing slow, a faint smile on his lips. I tucked the blanket around him and stood there for a long time, watching him dream, the quiet hum of the rain outside wrapping around us like a lullaby. Some endings don't need forgiveness, just distance. The next morning, the paper on my doorstep carried another headline, "Former church leader silent after viral outburst." I folded it neatly and dropped it straight into the recycling bin. The sound it made when it hit the pile was soft final. September came quietly like a sigh the world had been holding too long. By then, Boulder Creek was wrapped in gold. The air carried that early hint of fall. Cool mornings, warm afternoons, and the faint smell of leaves turning. Lucas and I packed a small picnic basket and drove down to the water. He wore his favorite red hoodie, the one with the sleeves too long, and carried a backpack full of books and snacks he'd picked himself. I spread the blanket while he immediately got to work near the stream, stacking stones into a little dam. "Careful," I said, laughing. "That water's freezing." "I'm not touching it," he replied, sticking his tongue out for good measure. "I'm building an engineering masterpiece." He said it with such seriousness that I didn't correct him. The sun caught his hair, turning it copper in the light. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. After a while, he sat beside me unwrapping his sandwich. We watched the water push and twist around the rocks he'd placed. The sound of it was soothing, like a voice you didn't realize you missed. "Mom," he said after a minute. "Yeah, do you miss Grandpa?" The question landed softly, but it still hit. I set my sandwich down and thought before answering. "Sometimes," I said honestly. "But missing someone doesn't mean you should go back." He nodded, chewing slowly. Then said, "I like our kind of Christmas better anyway." I smiled. Yeah, we get cookies and movies and no one yells." That made me laugh, really laugh, the kind that comes out of you before you realize it's there. "That's a pretty good deal," I said. He looked pleased, then went back to stacking stones. I lay back on the blanket, staring at the branches overhead. They swayed gently against the blue sky, and I realized how quiet my life had become. Not empty, not lonely, just quiet. Around mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed on the blanket beside me. I glanced at the screen. Rachel. I answered, brushing a leaf from my hair. "Hey," I said. Guess what she said, her voice bright even through the static. "You're officially reinstated. And Miller told me to tell you, quote, Summit owes her everything." His exact words. I laughed louder than I meant to. "You're kidding. Not even a little. He's rewriting your title, too. Something about financial strategy consultant. More pay, fewer headaches." I sat up. Finally something fair. "About damn time," she said, then lowered her voice. "You okay, Em?" "Yeah," I said after a beat. "Better than okay." We talked a little longer, about work, about Lucas, about how the world kept moving, even when you thought it might stop, and then hung up. I set the phone down, still smiling. Lucas was crouched by the stream again, examining his dam, like a scientist. "You look happy," he said without looking up. "I am," I said. "You did a good job here." He squinted at the water. "I think it's gonna break when the current gets stronger." "That's okay," I said. "Sometimes things are supposed to." We stayed until the sun dipped low enough to turn everything amber. On the drive home, the trees blurred past in streaks of gold and red. The radio played something soft, but I kept the volume low content with the hum of the road. As I turned onto Main Street, I slowed near the old church. I hadn't been there since the scandal, and I almost didn't recognize it without the crowds. The building stood quiet now, its lights dim, a few fallen leaves gathering on the steps. That's when I saw her. Mom sat alone on a bench near the entrance, her coat buttoned up to her neck, hair pinned neatly like always. She looked smaller somehow, but calm. A paper coffee cup rested on the bench beside her. She was staring at nothing in particular. Just the space in front of her, like someone learning how to exist in it. I slowed the car and stopped at the curb. For a moment I thought about getting out, about walking up and sitting beside her. But when she turned her head, our eyes met through the window. Her face softened. She smiled. Just a faint, quiet smile, the kind that doesn't ask for anything. I lifted my hand in a small wave. She returned it. No words. No gesture to come closer. Just that brief acknowledgement enough to say, "I see you." I drove on the rearview mirror, catching the last glimpse of her sitting there under the church lights as they flickered against the darkening sky. At home, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon. Lucas fell asleep in the car, so I carried him inside his head, heavy on my shoulder. I laid him in bed, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and kissed his forehead. In the living room, I turned off the lamp and stood by the window for a while, watching the wind scatter a few stray leaves across the street. The night was perfectly still. Peace doesn't always arrive with music. Sometimes it just sits beside you unannounced. December came back around before I realized it, quiet and soft, like it had nothing to prove. The snow outside our little Denver house drifted sideways, sticking to the window panes and muffling the world in white. Inside, the air smelled like sugar and butter. Lucas was in the living room, humming Christmas songs off-key while cutting paper stars with safety scissors. The tree leaned slightly to the left, half covered in his homemade ornaments. Crumpled paper snowflakes, popsicle stick angels. One old photo of us from years ago hanging crookedly near the top. I stood in the kitchen with flour on my hands, shaping cookie dough into uneven circles. It wasn't perfect, but neither were we. That was the point, Mom. "We need more color," Lucas said, holding up a star covered in too much glitter. "Pretty sure the vacuum's gonna hate you," I teased. He grinned. "Then we just won't tell it." The radio played faintly from the counter, old Christmas songs from another lifetime. I almost didn't notice the vibration of my phone until the screen lit up beside the rolling pin. A new text. From Mom, Merry Christmas. Thank you for leaving the door open. I stared at the message for a moment, the words simple but heavy. I typed back slowly, Merry Christmas. We're good. Hope you are too. I waited, half expecting another text. Nothing came. Just the quiet buzz of the heater, and Lucas singing slightly off rhythm in the other room. When I glanced again, there was still no message from Dad. Just silence. I thought about him sometimes, not in anger anymore, just in fragments. The smell of his aftershave, the click of his shoes on tile, the way his voice could fill a room before anyone else spoke. I wondered if he ever thought about me. But then again, maybe some silences are meant to stay that way. Mom, Lucas called. The cookies are burning. I laughed and rushed to the oven, pulling them out before they turned completely brown. Crisis averted, I said, setting the tray on the counter. The smell filled the kitchen. Sweet, warm, imperfect. We sat at the table, each with a mug of hot cocoa, the same mismatched ones from last year. The lights from the tree flickered against the window, reflecting back into the dark. Hey, Lucas said, suddenly pointing at the TV. That's Grandma. I turned. The local news was running a holiday segment. There she was, Margaret Carter, standing in front of a small community center with snow falling around her shoulders. The banner below read, Open Door Foundation launches in Denver supporting women, rebuilding family bonds. The reporter smiled into the camera. Founded by Margaret Carter. The Open Door Foundation will provide counseling and housing resources to women estranged from their families, particularly during the holidays. The footage cut to my mother speaking. Sometimes, she said, her voice steady, people just need a second chance to start over, with or without the people they came from. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I exhaled. See, Lucas said, grinning. Grandma gets it now. I looked at him. His eyes reflecting the glow from the TV. His confidence in the world unshaken. Maybe she finally does, I said, my voice catching a little. He reached for another cookie crumbs, dusting his sweatshirt. Can we send her some of these? Sure, I said. We'll make another batch tomorrow. The good ones, not the burned ones. He laughed. These are still good. I leaned back on the couch, sipping cocoa, watching the snow fall outside. The wind moved softly through the trees, brushing the window with quiet rhythm. I thought about how much had changed in just a year. The weight that used to live in my chest had lightened, not gone completely, but no longer crushing. On the coffee table sat the letter Mom had given me last spring, still unopened. I didn't need to read it. I knew every word by heart already. You can't rebuild the same house, I thought, watching the snow blur the lights of the street outside. But you can plant something where the ashes fell. Lucas yawned, curling against the arm of the couch. I turned down the lights and watched him drift off, the glow of the tree soft on his face. For a long time I sat there listening to the quiet, the hum of the world outside settling into itself. The past didn't vanish. It just stopped holding power. When the last song on the radio faded into static, I reached over, turned it off, and let the silence fill the room. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt like peace. The night settled over Denver like a blanket, thick and still, the kind of quiet that feels alive. The house glowed in the soft light of the Christmas tree, its crooked branches throwing uneven shadows across the walls. Lucas had fallen asleep on the couch halfway through a movie, one hand still buried in a bowl of popcorn, the other tucked under his cheek. His breathing was steady, deep, the sound of a child who had no idea how much his peace cost to protect. I sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders, journal open on my lap. Outside, snow drifted through the streetlights. Slow, lazy flakes that looked like they were taking their time to land. I picked up my pen, stared at the first blank line, and wrote, Last year I was uninvited. This year I'm home. The words looked small on the page, but they carried weight. I set the pen down and listened to the quiet. No calls, no chaos. Just the hum of the heater, the occasional crackle from the fireplace, and something even softer, the heartbeat of peace. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and cocoa. The tree lights flickered on a timer, each twinkle catching the edge of the window pane. I leaned my head against the glass, felt the faint chill seep through. This is enough, I whispered. Across the room, the TV screen was dark, reflecting the tree lights like a mirror of another world. I thought about all the Christmas Eves that came before. Crowded rooms filled with noise and obligation, forced smiles, the weight of pretending. Tonight there was none of that. Just me, my son, and the kind of silence that didn't ache anymore. A gust of wind brushed against the window, followed by the soft whistle it always made through the cracks in the old frame. I smiled. Some imperfections you learn to live with. Some you even come to love. In the reflection, I caught a glimpse of myself. Older, maybe a little worn, but still here. Still standing. That was something. I turned the page in my journal and let my thoughts wander. I wrote about Lucas, how he'd grown taller this year, how he'd stopped asking about his grandfather, but still mentioned Grandma sometimes with warmth. I wrote about the office and how things had settled back into rhythm. Rachel and I had rebuilt a small circle of sanity there, morning coffee inside jokes, a sense that work didn't own us anymore. I wrote about the foundation Mom had started. I'd seen her again briefly at a fundraising event in November. We didn't talk, not really, but she'd caught my eye across the room, smiled, and placed a hand over her heart. I nodded back. That was enough. Dad never showed. Word around Boulder was that he'd sold the big house and moved out of state. Rumor said Arizona, maybe Florida. He hadn't called, and I didn't expect him to. The idea of him had stopped haunting me. He was just another chapter that had ended. For a moment, the wind outside grew stronger, rattling the branches of the pine tree in the yard. The sound made me think of him. Sharp cold, but passing. It always passed. I glanced toward the living room again. The stockings on the mantel hung unevenly, one sagging lower than the rest. Lucas's handmade paper star was taped above them, the glue glitter catching light every few seconds. It made the whole room shimmer in rhythm with the fire. The night felt full but light, as if the house was breathing with me. I closed the journal, set it on the coffee table, and wrapped the blanket tighter. For a second, I let my eyes close, and in that quiet images moved through my mind. Quick flashes of what had been and what had changed. My father's office now empty, the desk bare, except for the outline of where his Bible once sat. My mother standing in front of her new foundation's banner, her hands clasped, but her smile real this time. Sarah walking through a park somewhere in California, her little girl tugging her hand toward a playground. Rachel laughing at her desk as someone handed her a cupcake for her birthday. Lucas sitting by the fire, eyes glowing as he told me about the world he planned to build. And then me sitting in this same house wrapped in quiet, finally understanding that peace isn't something you earn. It's something you allow. Revenge isn't about hurting them. It's about living better than they ever thought you could. I reached for my mug, took one last sip of cocoa, gone lukewarm, and smiled at the faint sweetness still left in it. The tree lights flickered again, reflected in the window like stars trapped in glass. Outside, the snow thickened soft and endless. The sound of wind swept through the eaves, a steady, gentle song that didn't ask for anything, didn't demand to be understood, just to be. I closed my eyes, breathing it in, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but earned. If this story reminds you of the moment you chose peace over pain, share it. Tell me how it felt when you stopped trying to fix what was never yours to carry. The wind moved again, brushing against the windows like a sigh, and the world seemed to pause. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang low and steady. Lucas stirred on the couch, murmured something in his sleep, and the lights shimmered across his face. I whispered good night to no one in particular, letting the moment stretch and settle. The world outside kept snowing, the sound faint and sure, and I sat there a little longer, letting the quiet hold me the way it always should have. See cookie preferences.